There's a moment that happens in these kinds of dynamics, and most people walk right past it without even noticing. It's the moment where everything quietly shifts, not because of an argument, not because of some big confrontation or emotional speech. It happens through something far more understated and honestly, far more powerful. Silence. But not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, the silence of someone who no longer feels the need to keep proving themselves. When you were still engaging, still showing up every time they pulled back, you were playing a role in a pattern. Maybe you didn't see it that way at the time, but that's exactly what was happening. They'd create distance. You'd move toward them. They'd go quiet. You'd start filling the space. Every time you did that, you were reinforcing the same loop over and over. It gave them room to breathe with zero consequences, and it gave you something to focus on, something to fix, something to hold on to. But underneath all of that, the dynamic was off. One person was always reacting, and the other was always setting the pace. The second you stopped doing that, when you chose to stay quiet instead of chasing, you didn't just change your behavior. You flipped the whole system, because now there was no response to their distance, no reassurance coming through, no emotional energy keeping the machine running. And that's when things start to get really interesting. Avoidants aren't cold because they're empty. They're distant because distance has always felt like the safest way to manage connection. Their entire sense of security is built on predictability. They pull back and they expect you to follow. That expectation is what gives them control. But when you go silent, you take that away. You introduce the one thing they're genuinely not comfortable with, uncertainty. And uncertainty doesn't sit quietly in the background. It forces the mind to start moving. It creates this internal friction where the old story no longer holds up. Suddenly, they're asking themselves questions they weren't asking before. Why haven't I heard anything? Did something shift? Did I lose something I just assumed would always be there? Those questions don't show up because you made a better argument or finally said the right thing. They show up because your silence created space for actual reflection, space that your constant presence was, without you realizing it, closing off. And here's what makes it even more layered. Your silence isn't just the absence of words. It's the presence of something they're not used to seeing from you. Self-respect. It communicates without a single sentence that your emotional state no longer orbits around their behavior, and that is genuinely disorienting for someone who's spent years being the one who sets the emotional tone. Because if they're not in control of the dynamic, they're suddenly forced to look at their own position in it, to actually sit with it. That's the real paradox here. By doing less, you showed more stability, more clarity, more emotional independence, and people feel that. Not right away in some logical way, but in their gut. There's a different kind of energy that comes off someone who is no longer out here looking for validation. It draws attention in a way that chasing never could. And this is exactly where most people misread the whole thing. They start treating silence like a strategy, like a move designed to get a reaction. But if that's what you're doing, it's still chasing, just dressed up differently. The actual power in silence doesn't come from using it as a tool. It comes from genuinely not caring about the outcome, from being truly settled either way, whether they respond or they don't, because that's what actually breaks the cycle at its foundation. That's what dissolves the emotional dependency that kept you locked in this back and forth. What you did, consciously or not, was step out of a reactive role and into one that's fully self-directed. You stopped asking how you could get them to come back. You started embodying the idea that you didn't need them to in order to feel okay. And that shift is enormous. Because the dynamic is no longer running on their distance. It's anchored in your steadiness now. And when one person becomes genuinely stable inside a dynamic that's always been unstable, everything has to reorganize around that. Sometimes that means they move closer. Sometimes it means they pull back even further. But either way, the illusion of control they were sitting on is gone. And what takes its place is something real. The truth about them. The truth about you. And the truth about what this connection actually is, underneath all the patterns. So hear this clearly. Your silence wasn't you shutting down. It wasn't avoidance. It was a quiet but complete redefinition of how you show up. And in that one decision, you did something most people never manage to do. You stopped trying to negotiate your own worth through how much you reacted. Because real power doesn't come from saying more. It comes from the moment you no longer feel any urgency to say anything at all. Here's what you also need to understand. Human behavior, especially in relationships, is not random. It's patterned. It's learned. It gets repeated until it becomes completely automatic, running in the background like something pre-programmed. Avoidants, like everyone else, are operating off a deeply embedded emotional script. It's not something they sit down and consciously decide. It's what they default to. Closeness builds pressure. Pressure becomes uncomfortable. Discomfort triggers withdrawal. That's the cycle. That's always been the cycle. But for that cycle to keep working, it needs something on the other end. It needs a counterpart who responds in a way that's expected. Someone who moves in when they move away. Someone who fills the silence. Someone who brings the emotional temperature back to something manageable for them. And honestly, that was you. Not because you were naive or weak, because you were genuinely invested. You cared. You wanted resolution. You wanted something real. So you kept closing the gap every time it opened. But the moment you stopped, everything changed. Because you didn't just step back. You pulled out the one input the whole system was depending on. And without that input, the pattern can't produce the same result. That's what unsettles them. Not your words, not your reasoning, your unpredictability. Control in these dynamics never actually comes from dominance. It comes from knowing exactly how the other person will respond. If I can predict you, I can manage around you. I can create distance because I know you'll come closer. I can avoid the hard stuff because I know you'll carry it. But the moment your response becomes something they can no longer anticipate, that control starts slipping. And everything they thought they understood about this dynamic has to be reconsidered. That's where Avoidant X comes in, to help you understand exactly what's happening beneath the surface and what to do with it. And here's the layer most people never get to. This stopped being just about you the moment you broke the pattern. Because when you stepped out of that role, you didn't just remove yourself from the equation. You removed the distraction. And now they're left with something they haven't had to sit with in a long time, themselves. Think about what that actually means. Everything you were providing, the reassurance, the emotional availability, the consistency, that doesn't just quietly fade out. It becomes a noticeable absence. And inside that absence, something uncomfortable starts rising to the surface. Questions they didn't have before. A sense of loss they genuinely didn't see coming. Because for the first time, they can't run the usual internal script. They can't tell themselves they'll deal with it later or that you'll still be there when they're ready. Your silence cuts right through that narrative. It forces a pause. And in that pause, something like awareness starts to creep in. Now, this doesn't mean they suddenly become a different person overnight. That's not realistic. But internally, something is different. There's friction, where things used to move smoothly. There's uncertainty where there used to be quiet control. And that friction is actually where the potential for real change lives. Most people try to create change by adding more conversation, more explanation, more effort. But what you did was the opposite. You created change by taking something away, something the pattern depended on. And when you pull a key piece out of any system, that system either has to adapt or it falls apart. That's where your actual power is, not in forcing a particular outcome, but in refusing to keep participating in something that was slowly diminishing you. Because once you stop playing your part, the other person faces a real choice. They either grow into something different or they disengage entirely. But either way, the dynamic that existed before is gone. And that's genuinely hard for a lot of people to sit with, because part of you might still want things to go back, just with a better result this time. But that's not how growth works. You don't fix a broken pattern by running it more carefully. You change it by stepping out of it completely. So when you didn't chase, when you didn't beg, when you didn't try to pull things back together through sheer persistence, you weren't just protecting yourself. You were rewriting the rules. You were showing through your actual behavior, not your words, that real connection isn't something you can pressure someone into. It has to be met with equal presence. And that realization, whether they ever say it out loud or not, is what stays with them. It lingers in the quiet, because now they've encountered a version of you that doesn't behave the way they predicted. And once someone experiences that, they can't go back to assuming they know how you'll respond. Don't underestimate what that is. You didn't just walk away from a moment. You interrupted a pattern that may have been running for years. And in doing that, you created the one thing that actually has the power to shift any dynamic, a break in certainty. Because people don't change when everything goes as expected. They change when what they were counting on no longer shows up. Here's something most people completely overlook. Your presence wasn't just maintaining the connection. It was actively protecting them from themselves. Every time you stepped in after they pulled away, every time you closed the distance they created, you weren't only holding the relationship together, you were absorbing the impact of their own avoidance. You were buffering them from the exact discomfort they've spent years learning to escape. And when you went silent, that buffer vanished. Suddenly, there was no one managing the emotional tension on their behalf, no one absorbing the uncertainty. No one coming in to stabilize what they destabilized, and that's where the real internal shift begins. Not in anything visible, but in what they're now forced to actually feel. Because avoidance isn't the absence of emotion, it's the refusal to process it. It's a pattern, usually built over a long time, of staying in control by staying detached. But that detachment only holds up when there's something external to lean against. When you were there, reacting, engaging, filling the space, you were that anchor. You gave them something to orient around without ever having to go inward. Remove that, and suddenly they're alone with their own interior. And that interior is rarely as calm as it looks from the outside. It's usually full of tension that's been deferred, not resolved. Emotions that have been postponed, not processed. But as long as the pattern keeps moving, they never have to face any of it. They can keep creating distance, keep managing, keep avoiding. Your silence stopped that movement. It created stillness. And in stillness, things come up. Now they're sitting with questions they've never had to ask. Why does this feel off? Why hasn't this person reacted the way they always do? Why do I feel unsettled when I was the one who wanted space in the first place? You didn't plant those questions. They arose on their own once the usual noise was gone. And that's the real paradox here. Your silence didn't cause their discomfort. It simply uncovered what was already there. This is where people tend to misread what stepping back actually does. They think it's about making someone miss them, or sending a message, or teaching a lesson. But the psychological impact runs much deeper than any of that. You didn't just remove your presence. You removed their escape route. Before, when things got too heavy, they could pull away and trust that you'd hold the connection in place. They could avoid the emotional weight because you were carrying a significant portion of it. But now there's no one to carry it, no one to make it lighter, no one to make it easier to sidestep. And when someone is left alone with what they've been avoiding, one of two things happens. They keep suppressing it, or they start to confront it. But either way, something is different now. It's heavier. It feels more real. It demands to be acknowledged in a way it didn't before. This is also where your role becomes most important, not through what you do, but through what you don't do. Because the instinct, especially when you still care about this person, is to step back in the moment you sense their discomfort, to reach out, check in, soften the tension. But if you do that, you hand them back the very buffer that allowed the pattern to keep going. Real growth doesn't happen in comfort. It happens when someone comes face to face with themselves. And that only becomes possible when the external noise clears. Your silence created that clearing. It gave them a genuine opportunity to experience their own emotional world without someone else managing it for them. Whether they choose to do something with that opportunity is entirely on them. But you created the conditions for it to exist, and at the same time, you did something just as important for yourself. You stepped out of the role of emotional caretaker. You stopped absorbing someone else's unprocessed feelings at the cost of your own stability. You let the dynamic stand without constantly propping it up. That's not avoidance. That's clarity. Because when you remove yourself from the cycle, you finally see it clearly. Not through the lens of what you hoped it could become, but for what it actually is. The imbalance, the unspoken expectations, the emotional labor that was only ever flowing one direction. And from that place of clarity, your decisions come from groundedness, not from reaction. So understand this. Your silence didn't push them away. It walked them directly into something they'd been running from. And in doing that, it didn't just reveal who they are. It revealed who you are when you finally stop carrying what was never yours to hold. Because the moment you stop shielding someone from their own reality is the moment both of you are forced, maybe for the first time, to actually see it. There's a deeply ingrained belief that strong emotion demands immediate expression. That urgency takes over. Say something, do something, fix something. But in any dynamic where avoidance is present, that instinct consistently works against you, because the more emotionally reactive you are, the more predictable you become. And the more predictable you are, the easier it is for the other person to keep their distance without ever feeling any real pressure to examine it. But when you chose not to react the way you usually would, something far more significant stepped into that space. Your non-reaction wasn't indifference, it wasn't coldness. It meant you were no longer willing to turn your genuine care into something that looked like chasing. And that distinction matters more than most people realize, because emotional reaction is often mistaken for strength. It feels active. It feels like you're doing something that counts. But when that reaction is really being driven by the need for a specific response from the other person, it's not strength. It's dependency in motion. It quietly communicates, without you ever intending it, that your emotional footing depends entirely on what they do next. And that's what Avoidant X is here to help you see and move beyond. And for someone who has spent years dodging emotional responsibility, an open, reactive dynamic is incredibly easy to step away from. Your non-reaction changed that completely. Instead of pouring more energy into the pattern, you cut off the fuel supply. You didn't escalate. You didn't over-explain. You didn't chase resolution through more conversation. And in doing that, you sent a different kind of signal altogether. One that doesn't need words to land. A signal that says, I know what I feel, but I'm not going to lose myself trying to manage you. That's not coldness. That's discipline. And emotional discipline is one of the most misunderstood forms of strength that exists, because it doesn't look impressive from the outside. It doesn't make noise. It shows up as composure, as restraint, as the ability to hold your own internal experience without needing to broadcast it just to feel seen. And when someone who is accustomed to triggering reactions stops getting them, it puts them in an unfamiliar position. They can no longer easily read where they stand. They can no longer use your responses as a gauge of how invested you are. That ambiguity creates a genuine shift, because now, instead of you working to demonstrate your value through effort, they're left trying to make sense of your value through your absence. And absence, when it comes from a place of genuine self-respect, carries a weight that words almost never do. Words can be argued with, explained away, dismissed. But a steady, consistent lack of reaction, especially when it replaces a long pattern of engagement, feels like something final. It suggests a line that isn't being debated, it's just being held. This doesn't mean you stop expressing yourself entirely. It means your expression becomes a choice, not a reflex. There's a real difference between speaking from clarity and reacting from emotional urgency. One earns respect over time, the other quietly erodes it. And here's the layer that runs even deeper. Your non-reaction wasn't only about how they saw you, it changed how you began to see yourself. Because every time you resist the pull to seek validation from outside yourself, you're reinforcing a different sense of who you are. You start to recognize yourself as someone who can hold steady, someone who doesn't come apart under uncertainty, someone who doesn't need immediate resolution to feel okay. That internal shift is what makes everything else sustainable. Because if silence is just a tactic, it won't hold. The moment discomfort spikes, you'll slide back into the old pattern. But if silence comes from a genuine place of self-respect, it stops being a strategy. It becomes natural. It becomes consistent. And consistency is what gradually reshapes how people relate to you. So what happened here wasn't passive. It was deliberate. You replaced reaction with intention. You replaced urgency with composure. And you shifted the emotional equation without saying a single word. The person on the other side felt that, even if they couldn't name what changed. There's a difference between someone who is clearly trying to get a reaction and someone who simply isn't offering one anymore. One feels like something that can be taken for granted. The other feels grounded, self-contained, and less easily accessed. That shift alone changes the entire dynamic. So don't minimize what you chose not to do. In a world where most people react first and think later, Your ability to stay composed is genuinely rare. It forces a recalibration in the other person, not because you pressured them into it, but because your presence alone communicated something different. Because at the highest level, power has nothing to do with controlling what someone else does. It's about mastering what you do. And the moment you stop reacting out of need is the moment your presence starts naturally commanding respect without you ever having to ask for it. What starts to unfold at this point is quiet, but it might be the most significant shift in this entire dynamic. Because what the avoidant has really been guarding this whole time isn't just their independence, it's their sense of control. Control over distance, control over timing, control over how much of themselves they expose at any given moment. And as long as that control stays intact, they can stay connected without ever feeling truly vulnerable. But the moment you stopped responding the way they expected, that control began to loosen. Not dramatically, not all at once, but something internally shifted. The tools they'd always relied on, the withdrawal, the silence, the distance, stopped producing the familiar result. You didn't chase, you didn't fill the gap, you didn't reinforce the cycle, and without that reinforcement, their usual approach lost its grip. Here's where it goes deeper. When control starts slipping, it doesn't just create confusion, it creates awareness, because control is often just a cover for vulnerability. It creates the illusion that everything is manageable, predictable, contained. But when that illusion cracks, what's been sitting underneath starts coming through. And what's underneath is usually something they haven't had to sit with fully, the reality of genuine connection, and the very real possibility of losing it. Avoidants don't typically experience loss the way others do, not because they're incapable of feeling it, but because they structure everything around staying ahead of it. By maintaining distance and limiting emotional exposure, they reduce the risk of being hurt. But that same strategy limits how deep any connection can actually go. It's a trade that feels safe right up until something disrupts it. Your silence disrupted it, because suddenly the distance they created didn't feel like control anymore. It felt like separation. And those two things are completely different. Control is something you choose. Separation is something you experience. One gives a sense of power, the other opens the door to loss. And that's where something unexpected starts to happen. What used to feel like comfortable independence starts feeling uncertain, because that space is no longer being softened by your presence. It just sits there, and in that space, questions start forming. Not always clearly, not always consciously, but they're there. Is this connection still there for me? Did I take this too far? What if this time they actually don't come back? These aren't rational questions. They're emotional ones, born from a shift in reality. Because when someone who was consistently present becomes still, becomes quiet, becomes genuinely unavailable, their absence stops feeling temporary. It starts feeling chosen. And chosen absence carries an entirely different weight. This doesn't mean they immediately reverse course or open up overnight. Avoidant patterns don't dissolve that quickly. But internally, the experience has changed. There's a growing sense that something real may no longer be within reach in the same way it once was. And that awareness tends to generate curiosity. Curiosity about you, about what shifted, about where you actually stand now. But more importantly, curiosity about themselves, about their own patterns, about the role they played and how things got here. Because when control is no longer a given, self-reflection becomes much harder to sidestep.